David, welcome back to the People Quotient Podcast. Great to have you back again after our first episode. We covered so much ground in that episode. For those who have listened and those who haven't, they should go check it out. It was all about building and growing high-performing teams to achieve the ultimate goal that you as a team leader have, whether it's a CEO. I think we talked about CEOs, coaches, investors, the whole gamut. But in this episode, I think what we're going to be talking about is peak performing individuals. So it's the individuals who make up that team. And, this is a topic that both leaders and individuals will find interesting because this is a very personal component. Now, this is at that individual level, literally in the name. And so, I'm going to start off, David, by the question that I came in thinking about is, are people born as peak performers, as top performers? Is that an inherent thing within them, or do they become peak performers over time?
Yeah, super question. So I suppose I suppose my answer is that I hope people will receive it as good news. There is good news here. Peak performers are definitely not born. Peak performers are made. And they make themselves with the support and counsel of others. If you think about it, I would say when you look out, even people who, however you're defining it, are currently performing really, really well in whatever walk of life they're in, all of us have untapped performance within us. And in defining, if I use the word performance very deliberately, you'll hear people talk about untapped potential. That's the more usual phrase.
Yeah.
I talk about untapped performance because performance is made up of two components. One which we generally talk about a lot, and one which really gets ignored, but we can learn a lot about from the sports world.
Okay.
So performance is made up of potential, and I would say nearly all of us have untapped potential, but it's also made up of, or rather limited by, interferences, things that get in the way of that potential delivering a full performance.
Yeah.
Put simply, we can put it in an equation, Rohit. And in sports, we use this a lot. That performance equals potential minus interferences. And if I think about the corporate world, we probably talk a lot about and do a lot around leveraging potential, building knowledge, building experience, creating opportunities for people, giving people coaching, and so on. But what we tend not to do much, I don't think we could learn a lot from our friends in the world of sport, is really understand and do work around limiting our interferences. And only by unlocking both can you get to peak performance.
I love that. And just for the audience, I know I love equations, so you didn't just develop this equation for my benefit. This is actually, as you said, but I love it because it makes me understand it a lot better, and hopefully for the audience as well. So it's if I was to variabilize it, is it performance equals potential minus interference? So capital P equals small p minus small I for visual folks. Okay, that's cool. It. I think I'm on my way. I'm on my way to some sort of higher performance. God knows it's taken a while. So with that said, David, two questions come up. One is when you speak of interference, what does that look like? What is that? How does that? Where is that coming from? Because I think I understand some elements of it instinctively when you say that. Inhibitions, reluctance, inner friction, those thoughts that sort of say you can't do it and they manifest all the time. So is that what it is, or is it something else? And the second piece is when you speak about in the sports world, can you share some examples of when it manifests or it has manifested, and how those who are peak performers, what do they do with it? So perhaps the second one is more of a longer conversation in the entirety of this episode, but in any direction you want to take, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two questions.
Yeah, sure. So yes, interference largely you would define as, if anyone listening to this recognizes this, it's that voice in your head. It's those self-limiting thoughts. It's those fears that you may have. It's the things that get in the way of self-belief, of self-confidence. And if you're listening or watching this with honesty in your heart, you'll recognize yourself in that description, because it's true of all humans. We all have it to one degree or another. And without working to limit or maybe even extinguish those self-limiting thoughts, that voice in the head, it doesn't matter how much you leverage your potential, you'll never be at peak performance. Sally Gunnell, who was a British 400-meter hurdler, probably one of the most successful in terms of holding titles, one of the most successful athletes of all time. Sally was at one time British, Commonwealth, European, world, and Olympic champion. And just to throw in for good measure, she also held the world record, all at the same time.
Wow.
And she had a voice in her head that meant that when she walked onto the track, despite all that success, despite the proof of her greatness, when she walked onto a track, she would look at the athletes against whom she was about to compete, and she would mentally come up with all sorts of reasons why each one of them was better than her, why each one of them was going to beat her.
Yep.
And her coach said to her, he wanted to find a way of taking the fear out of having to deal with your own doubts, with your own insecurities. Because very often for us to confront those kind of things is quite a scary thing. We don't often do it because it's a scary place to go, or so we believe. Yeah. So he wanted to take the sting out of it. And so he described to her, he said, it's like you've got a little duck sitting on your shoulder, and it's quacking, and it's talking away to you, and it's telling you all these self-limiting things, these reasons. It's quacking away. And the lifeblood of the duck is your fear. It's your insecurity. And that's what the duck feeds off. And if you're not careful, you start to believe the duck. And so you become diminished as a result.
Yep.
And he said to her, all you've got to work on going forward, Sally, is you've got to learn how to shut the duck up.
Yeah.
And this imagery, this thought that it was this silly little fluffy thing quacking in her ear, took the sting out of the situation and enabled her to really work on that. And it's a concept that I've subsequently adopted and use in all the work that I do. So you'll very often recognize people that I've worked with if you get alongside them privately, because they're all talking about ducks. But it's a super way. It's a super way of taking the fear out of confronting something that unless you do deal with, you will never be at peak performance, right? So you asked me about what we can learn from the sports world. You know, if we take the golfer, for example, you stand on, and any amateur golfers listening will I think identify with this. You stand on a tee of a par 3 hole, and down the left-hand side of the fairway is a forest, which is out of bounds. The golfers will know that. Along the right-hand side is a lake. Between you and the hole or the green are some of the most horrendously deep bunkers you've ever seen in your life. And the green is tiny little postage stamp size, with the flag just beyond the deepest, just on the green, just beyond the deepest of those deep bunkers. Most of us, when we stand on that tee, what we see is the forest, the bunkers, and the lake. We see our fears. We see the things that are scary about what we're about to embark on. The professional golfer sees the flag and taps into their experience. I've been here before. I played this game, this hole before.
Yeah.
What do I need to do? What club do I need? How far onto? So they're looking at facts and data, and they're seeing a razor focus on the object, which in this case for the golfer is the flag. They see something different to the rest of us. Is that inherently born, going back to your original question, in that golfer? No. Yeah. It's a learned behavior.
Yeah.
It's a behavior that comes from quietening the duck, who's just talking about the forest and the lake and the bunkers, and the wind's going to carry it, and if you're not careful, you're going to drop a shot, and if you drop a shot and your opponent's birdie the hole, you're going to be 2 further behind than you were before, and before we know it, we've catastrophized an event that is not destined to happen, but we're creating that event in our own heads. The golfer has learned to quell that storm, to become singularly focused. The great lesson for the rest of us is that if that golfer can do it in that circumstance, we can do it in our circumstance too.
That's really helpful. And I think that, however, the question that comes to my mind is that when interferences arrive, now that you've described it, and I'm sort of thinking about all the times when that happens, it's an involuntary, often, starting point where it sort of shows up, right? And not always, but often. And so for people listening, and we're talking about peak performing individuals, and where you've articulated as peak performing individuals, the reason they become that is they're reducing, or they've figured out ways to reduce, minimize, even eliminate the dark that is a proxy for interference that's within you. But for those who are on that journey, right? So they're listening in saying, hey, look, I relate to it, David. I get it. I hear the voices all the time, but I sometimes it's too late. I can't control those voices. So what is it that where do elite athletes or corporate executives who have mastered the controlling of the duck, what does that journey look like for people, so people can say, hey, look, at a personal level, how do I get on this journey? Because by the sounds of it, it is a lot of practice, right? It won't happen overnight. And so any thoughts on how to get on that journey?
Yeah. So I think an important stepping point is to understand what's actually going on when these self-limiting beliefs or these voices come to us. Because you're right, it is involuntary. And it's because what is happening, we need to think about the neuroscience that lies behind it. Fundamentally, what's happening in these moments is we are triggered by something. we're either triggered by a fear that we have, or an environment in which we find ourselves, or by the behaviors of other people. These are the typical three categories that will trigger this process that we are starting to describe, Rohit. And what is happening from a neuroscientific point of view is when we are triggered, there is a part of the brain called the amygdala. Maybe some people listening in will be familiar with this. And what happens is the amygdala releases chemicals. There is a chemical reaction when we are triggered. And our diminished response, our diminished behavior is as a result of the effect that those chemicals have once they're released in our brain. Fundamentally, what happens when the chemicals are released is that our neocortex, which is the logical, the thinking part of our brain, is disconnected. And what we are left with is the emotional part of our brain. So in that moment, in order to break that mechanism, in order to return and put us on the path to peak performance, we have to find a way of re-engaging the neocortex, the logical, the intelligent part of the brain. And so you're right, the journey that you're describing is twofold. There's what I would call the longer term journey, which is around the more that I understand myself, the more that I understand the type of fear, the type of voice that shows up for me, the more I can head it off at the pass. And that is what sustains me on a longer term journey of peak performance. But at the same time, because we're all human, and because none of us are perfect, there will be moments when the duck breaks through, because it's a smart little thing. And it will break through from time to time, even for those that are on this longer term sustainable journey. So then the question becomes, if it breaks through and the chemical reaction happens, which by the way happens in 6 seconds, that's just the physiological makeup of the human, that is going to happen. So then in those moments, we've got to find a way of, how do I recognize that in the moment and do something in the moment? So I'm on my long-term journey, but when the duck does break through, periodically when I'm on that journey, I need to step in that moment and bring myself out of the chemical reaction so I can re-engage the thoughtful, the logical part of my brain. And funny though it is, for those folks out there that can remember either a mother or a father or a guardian who used to say to them when they were little, just breathe, just take 10 seconds, think about it. Whether they knew what they were saying to us or not, whether they knew the root and the power of what they were saying to us or not, Rohit, they were absolutely spot on. Anything that you can do in those little moments that breaks into that chemical reaction that takes you out of the situation. So whether it's just sitting there and breathing, whether it's getting up and switching the kettle on if you're in the meeting room, whether it's getting up and walking around your desk, any of these little, silly, seemingly meaningless moments are purposeful because they break that chain. They break that chemical and give you chance to re-engage and come back in a different frame of mind. And these are the two journeys, the smaller and the long-term journey that many, certainly those in sport that I work with, this is what we're working on all the time. It's mind management. This is the key to peak performance. It's mind management. That's what makes, on the individual level, the difference between those that are good or great and those that are truly distinctive. It's the difference from being a one-time world champion to being a multiple world champion. It's the continuous awareness and work on this longer term path and these moments that happen along the way.
Yeah, and you know a few world champions, so I think you speak from experience, having worked with quite a few of those elite performers. The thing that pops out for me, David, as I sort of reflect on some of the notes I was taking, was it's almost like and tell me if I'm misreading this, but it's almost like the wiring that we are brought up with, which is often focused on, as you said, the potential, right? Work on your strengths, improve your potential, work on building that skill set. Whilst that is true, it almost feels like, at least as I've now reflecting on my years of continuous interference, that the training ought to be reduce your interference, because the sooner you can get to the reduction, you're actually going to amplify your overall performance and on your path to peak performance. So is it controversial to say then that, working on your strengths is not the best strategy, or am I going too far?
I would say, I think it's slightly more nuanced. I would say it's not the only strategy, right? I think you should do that, because remember, performance is the maximizing of potential and the minimizing of interference. So you do want to work on your potential, absolutely, but it's not enough on its own. If that's all you do, and you do it phenomenally well, it's still not enough, because the interferences will always reduce the power of what you get from your potential. So when I look into the corporate world in particular, and I was I was part of it myself as an employee, as it were, for a decade. The frustration is that things like strength-based coaching came along, right? And that's terrific, and I'm a big supporter of it. But how are we helping people? How are we helping ourselves to minimize our interferences?
Yeah.
This, to me, is this has to be, and would be exciting if it was the next big thing in people development in the corporate setting. Because I tell you, where I've seen it happen, what happens as a result is the level of performance from an individual is off the charts. The level of happiness that individual experiences releases an even greater level of performance than just working on minimizing the interferences does. And guess what? Organizations that invest in their talent to be able to do that have zero problem retaining top talent.
Yeah. So that's a cue for a lot of CEOs who will be listening in as to, my question, for my team would be, or is, what does that look like? What does that investment look like when you talk about reducing the interference as the goal? Obviously, you as the leader would know all the strengths of individual members of your team, and you're trying to maximize individual performances. And often we talk about things that don't go well in a performance review, right? And so every company has an annual performance review. Every athlete has an annual, it's not even annual, it's daily, weekly performance review, definitely after a big race or a big sporting event. And so in their world, it's a lot more continuous and a lot more impactful, because they don't have a lot of opportunities. The runway is shorter. Whereas in a corporate world, you may have a longer runway. So if I'm a CEO listening in saying, hey, David, what does that investment look like in my athletes, on my team? Any word of advice for them on that topic?
Yeah, I think there are potentially a couple of big standouts. I think one is, and you've alluded to it there, it's to, if I think internally within an organization, how can you devise and design your appraisal system to be more regular without being onerous on those who are administering it and running it, right? This is not about creating a bureaucracy, but this is about creating more checking points, because that and designing it in a way that incorporates performance as hopefully we are now coming to understand it as being both what you deliver and what might get in the way. Right, so design it with both of those aspects in mind, so that this becomes a continuous conversation, and it's out there. It's out there for us all to know. And if I think back to our first episode, Rohit, where we were talking about high performing teams, high performing teams talk about this kind of stuff as a team. They talk about their own journey to peak performance. Why? Because there's trust in a high-performing team, as we talked a lot about last time, and because of that, you can be more vulnerable with one another. You can talk about your own journey to peak performance, and so it becomes something that these two things sit beautifully together, a high-performing team and team members who are on a journey to personal peak performance. So it becomes a language. It becomes part of the culture of the organization, both in conversational terms, but also in process terms, appraisals and reviews and mentoring and coaching, and whatever facilities a CEO has in his or her organization, those processes should be extended so that they can incorporate the types of things that we're talking about. And that's another identifiable trait, for example, of a high-performing organization from a people point of view, that is creating peak-performing individuals.
It's really, I think if I step back and summarize what you've said so far, is there's a few things. One is programmatically, a CEO should be thinking about both variables, not just the one. Often, if not always, we think about performance, but we don't think about interferences that an individual has. But the thing that you're sort of alluding to is on the interference piece, there are two aspects. One is within, and the other one is without, right? So within the human, that there is interference that requires a lot of introspection, self-awareness, and sort of like that takes. But once you start thinking about it, so for those who are thinking about themselves in this conversation, they're like, what are the sources of interferences and when do they manifest? And if they do, to your point, some of the examples of what they could do to minimize it, to understand that it's purely an interference, it's not reality. And so that starts to reduce the interference within. On the outside, you mentioned environments, team, systems, structure, which is both something that an individual can influence, but leadership teams who are building those environments and structure, they're the ones who can create the most impact. So those who are trying to help people reach their peak performance and have access or decision rights on those environments. And that's where your counsel is, that part of its reviews, but within those reviews include these things. So the conversations had. And I think that's a really good cycle, because I can imagine in the examples you were talking about in the sports world, where a team is talking about interference and they're helping the individual, and especially Formula One, where you've got one or two individuals on a team who are driving, but there's a massive, massive team around them. Them talking about it creates this really nice, I would imagine, I'm not there, I've never been there, but you have. And so it creates a really nice dynamic, I can imagine, of the person who is trying to improve and looking at their interferences, but the team also saying, how can we be better, but also help him reduce their interference. So that sort of creates a positive loop. Am I extrapolating too much, or is that how it really happens on the Formula One track?
Yeah, that's exactly how it happens. That there's this kind of a chain effect, right? Because we've got this common understanding of what performance is made up of, and we're all on that journey together. It's not just the driver that desires to be at peak performance. It's every member of that team that is striving. And so what better way to do that than to support one another through that common language and that common understanding that you have, rather than us all trying to work on it just individually. Now, there is the individual element, right? And so what I would say to the CEOs and the leaders out there is invest up front. It's quite it's a difficult journey to go on your own, confronting that duck, understanding your fears, admitting them, figuring out why they're there and where they come from, getting clarity on what is the impact that they have on your behavior. When you show up as a diminished version of yourself, what is the impact of that on you, and what is the impact of that on those that are around you, right? That's a very difficult journey to go on your own. So to the leaders out there, I would say, when you think about that part of the journey, invest in people, get a coach. See it as a long-term investment, that the coach doesn't need to be around forever. A good coach shouldn't be around forever, right? But it's important that they can get your people off to a good start, and they can share techniques that allow you to become self-sustaining. But because it's a scary journey for most of us to begin, having that independent advisor, coach, whatever you call the person, at the beginning of your journey is incredibly important, so that you do actually start the journey, you don't shy away from it, and that you're advised with techniques and tips and tricks that will allow you to become self-sustaining over the medium term. Then you don't need the coach anymore. But to the leaders, you have a role to play in the atmosphere and the culture that you create for the teams that you lead, and you have a role to play in getting your folks and yourself off to a great start by investing in a bit of external support to get the journey started, safe in the knowledge that if you get a good person to help you with that, they will equip you with the skills to be able to maintain that journey without them.
What are some of for those people who are saying, it's again, I'm playing devil's advocate. Some people say, hey, look, we can get more resources to help, but you've seen the end game here. You've seen what happens when this happens. So are there examples of individuals from whether it's football or Formula One or golf or any other sport or business that you can think of where when the individual or the team, but because we're talking about peak performing individuals, when such an investment was made either by the person or their management, that it was transformative? Any examples that stand out and that you can share with us that sort of bring all of this to light as to, we understand conceptually, but when did that happen, and people can sort of visualize a bit better?
So a couple of examples, I would say, from, let's go back to our Formula One conversation from the first episode. And let me talk to you about Nico Rosberg. And for those that are not familiar with Formula One, Nico was for many years the Mercedes teammate of Lewis Hamilton. And this was during a period when Mercedes were at the top of the sport. They were literally winning drivers and constructors world championships, both back to back to back to back over a number of years. But the driver's title was always going to Lewis.
Yeah.
Why was that? Nico had always worked with a mind coach, as he calls them. But I don't think he'd really worked on the interferences in as crystal clear a way as was necessary.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of those interferences were to do with the team, right? He had a belief that Lewis was the favoured driver, that Lewis was privy to information that he wasn't, that Lewis was getting upgrades to his car that he wasn't, etc., etc. And it didn't matter whether these things were true or not. These were the things that his job was telling him. I use those as examples. There was a lot else. So at the start of the 2016 season, Nico decided, because he's a smart guy, he was going to throw everything at it that season. And so we started to do some work, particularly on these really deep-seated interferences. And it was the breakthrough. Nothing else changed. He was driving the same car. He had the same dietary coach. He had the same dietary regime. He had the same fitness training. He didn't increase, decrease, didn't change anything else other than a razor focus with a clear goal and target that this was the year that he was going to be the world champion.
Yeah.
At the end of 2016, Nico was the Formula One world champion.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
That's a really powerful story.
But you know, yes, of course, okay, it's an extreme example from a particular world, from a particular part of the sporting world, and there was a season-long focus and combination of support that propelled him to that. Absolutely, I accept that, but the fundamentals are absolutely transferable to anybody in any walk of life. And I know that because I've done the same kind of work with people in the corporate world who are running businesses. I've done it with emerging leaders. I've done it with new recruits at the graduate level. I've done it with disadvantaged kids in local communities. I've done it with senior and junior politicians. I've done it with teachers in schools. It doesn't matter who you are or the walk of life that you find yourself on.
Yep.
The human condition is the human condition.
Yep.
And working on this will transform you, whoever you are, and wherever in life you find yourself.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just happen, right? It's an investment. It's primarily an investment choice that you make in yourself. And it's an investment choice that you or others on your behalf can make to get you the support to begin the journey that then becomes a self-sustaining one.
Yeah. That's really powerful example. And also the fact that all of these facets, these people that you work with, and there's a multiple dimension. And so it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in and what's your environment, by being able to reduce the interference, You can, in fact, my takeaway from this conversation so far is that, perhaps, there is time in life to build that potential and to build your strengths. And I think you've got to do that because early on in your career, you don't have a lot of tools in your toolkit. And so as you're building your toolkit, naturally the human experience, call it that, lends itself to bring in these interferences. And some of us work through some of these interferences, have some success. Others work through a lot of them, have a lot of success, but many don't break through that. And many of them sort of get sort of withheld. And so what you're saying is, whether you want to be a peak performing individual or a high performing individual or a performing individual, you can take your spectrum, the potential's there. Work on, if you've gotten to a point in your life where you're listening to this episode and all of what we're saying actually makes sense already, then you're already at that point where you've achieved a lot of things and all you want to achieve. There's ambition, aspiration, and experience all within you. And so now might be a great time, whether you do it yourself and or with the help of others around you, to get that coach or to get that mentorship to work on reducing that interference. And again, it's not a lifelong investment, to your point, but it is one that if you don't start now, it could take a lifetime to get there. And I'm sure Nico does not look back and said, "What if I had not done that?" He's already, now he's a world champion, right? He's got that title for the rest of his life, and and so to me that's the goal, right? But you've got to set that goal within you. The one question that did come up to, when you talk about such moments of you're within the moment, the interference is coming up, and let's say you do get better at being aware of it, 6 seconds it's already gone and it's happened. Are there other practices how does one get outside of their self to be able to look back in? It's almost like an out of body experience that you're describing, or out of mind experience, where you being able to reflect on it, in 7 seconds or 8 seconds, and still pretty good, saying, wow, this is happening to me now. And obviously that takes practice, but is there a special kind of practice that, peak performers, elite performers, distinctive performers tend to do that sort of is conducive to, reducing interference?
I think it varies. So the short answer is yes, but it's not a universal answer. It varies between individuals. So some people will have little mantras when they can feel interference coming on, when they can feel themselves being triggered, when they, even before that, they are about to enter a situation that they know historically carries the risk of a triggering moment, an interference moment. Some people will have a mantra that they'll just silently go through in their head that prepares them for that moment, or that they will recite in their head in that moment. Some people have a touchstone, so they'll do something with a ring.
Okay.
Or they'll put an elastic band, or have a little a bracelet that they wear already, and they do a particular maneuver with it. Humans we are pattern recognition beings.
Yeah.
We are habits-based beings. So use that natural tendency and turn it into a helpful strength that you can have.
Yep.
So the mantra, the playing with the ring, the rubber band around the wrist, a particular picture as your wallpaper on your phone. If you are a notebook person, which I tend to be, I will have something written or a picture or a symbol that I draw in my notebook, and I just have that page open in front of me. No one else in the room even notices it. And if they did, they'd have no recognition, they'd have no clue. But to me, it triggers a thought process which helps me to intervene in the 6-second or just after the 6-second moment. So any of these rituals, as we would call them, any of these habits that are meaningless to other people, but carry great meaning for you, that help you in that moment, use them. Lean into the fact that we are pattern recognition beings, that we are creatures of habit, and create a habit, create a pattern that helps you in those moments. These are the kinds of things that are the self-sustaining, ongoing rituals and habits that I was referring to before.
No, I love that. I think a lot of people probably have their own habits, and I think what it's almost doing, it's almost taking you out of you in that moment, and sort of it's almost like a snap, like as you said, just that sort of breaking that cycle in a way that's very subtle, it's very personal, it's a practice that builds over time, and almost sounds like the way you were describing it, it's like having a bit of a balcony moment, sort of looking outside in and sort of saying, hang on, this is something interesting is happening here that I know where this is going to lead to, which is going to be a big interference and is going to get in the way of me in this very moment performing. And so how can I get out of it? And so it's that experience that you're describing, and it happens over time. So I think what a lot of what you're saying is that it is a moment where pattern recognition plays a role, intent plays a role, but most importantly, it's self-awareness that comes with it, is where people who are, the more self-aware you become, the more introspective you are, the more likelihood of you knowing when these things happen and therefore being able to address them. And so it sort of starts right there at that point in time. And your environment and team and your leaders, if they can notice these things, when they can say, hey, look, when we go back to the previous episode, you mentioned, people who are quieter in the room, who have a lot of knowledge, who have got, who are not speaking up. I think perhaps it's that interference playing through again in their heads, right? Hey, what, is this the right moment? Am I going to say something smart? What I'm about to say probably doesn't add that much value. And then soon enough, they're having this conversation while the room has moved on. And then it's too late. And they're like, oh, I had a great idea. Or you hear someone else say the same exact thing you were about to say, and you're like, well, I was about to say that. And man, I should have. And I've had that many a times in my life. And I think what it is a manifestation of this interference that you're describing. But in that moment, having a practice. So if it happens once in a meeting or in an event or in a competition, that's okay. If you've got another shot, even in that moment, to your point, having a practice saying, well, it just happened. Let me not do that again. And so over time, then you get that practice. So is that starting to sound like, obviously we're not talking about me becoming an elite athlete anytime soon, but in terms of improving performance, does that sound like the right set of tools that people listening in should start to be thinking about as they think about improving their potential, as well as reducing the interference?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it speaks to how do I become a great leader of myself, as well as how do I become a great leader of others, right? Yeah. And it all starts, the journey does begin with self-awareness. Self-awareness gives you choice. So in your example, in that moment when I was thinking of something, but my gut was telling me, don't speak out because you're probably wrong, and they probably won't like that message, and you've not really thought it through. And while all this conversation is going on in your head, the conversation in the room has moved on, and somebody's just said the thing that you were about to say, but your duck stopped you saying in your example, right? Yeah. The more aware you are that is happening to you, the more choice you have to react in a different way next time it happens. And that's the kind of the basic component of how do I get better at leading myself.
Yeah.
And when you start to get more aware of that in yourself, you start to become more aware of it and notice it more in others.
Yeah.
And that awareness of others, the leading self is self-awareness. The leading others is awareness of others. And the two are born out of the same skill set. So the more that I become aware of others through my better understanding of what I'm going through, the more choice I have about how I then lead others. How do I support other people to break through in the way that I'm journeying to break through for myself? And so it becomes a dual serving purpose. I'm getting better at leading myself through my greater awareness of myself. My greater awareness of myself makes me more aware of what might be going on for others. And therefore, I can become a better leader of others by becoming a better leader of myself.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll talk in the next episode, we were talking about leadership and how, leaders who become peak performing leaders, how they differentiate, how can they themselves differentiate from others who are leaders or, wanting to get to that peak performance leadership level. One question I did have for you as you were describing is that, peak performing individuals, it's very clear when you've got a, Lewis Hamilton, or a Lando Norris, or you've got Ronaldo. Like you got players on the team. They're very visible. But then there are, for the most of us, we don't have ultra high peak performing people around us all the time. But there is that potential that you talk about. So as a CEO, if I'm listening to you saying, okay, I buy that I need to invest in my team. I buy that the journey needs to begin sooner rather than later, both in myself and my team. But I can't afford to, I don't know where to start. I don't know how to identify the person or the people, because I buy the notion that everybody can improve performance. And that's what I'm underwriting when I hire them. But how do I pick the ones that have got really that potential to be truly peak performers? Because there is that sort of handful who become Cristiano Ronaldo or Lando Norris or Lewis Hamilton and so on and so forth, right? There's only a few of them. So the business world of that, is there any guidance on how to identify people who will hit that sort of top mark?
So let me pick up on the point of the Ronaldo or the Hamiltons of this world.
Yeah.
One of the dangers is that some people's interference can propel them to become so important that there's no room for others.
Right.
There's no room for others to excel or to shine. And there's always a spotlight on stage, but it doesn't mean that everybody else is in the dark. Everybody is lit. There might only be one particular spotlight, but everybody is lit. And sometimes you might want to think about the broader scenario of what might be getting in the way of me having a truly highly performing team that's made up of multiple people who are at or approaching peak performance. Not just one person that's pulling the team along, but actually a team of peak performers.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to pick up on that point because there's a nuance there, right? Some of the, if I think of some of the footballers, for example, that I've worked with, I would say some of them have been at continuous peak performance, both for their club teams and their national teams, but may not have carried the spotlight or the headline in the way that a Ronaldo has, for example. So your peak performers are not necessarily the ones that are constantly being talked about or in the spotlight. They may just be at peak performance, making a huge difference, but going about their business quite quietly.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
And it's not that one's right and one's wrong, by the way, Rohit, but it's making sure that we're not singularly associating peak performance with star of the team.
Right.
It may be, but it may not be.
Yeah, I think the point that you raised in there was also an interesting one, because if there's one person who is that star, then there's a lot of pressure on them, and so when they break, the whole team breaks. So you've also got to create as a leader, especially in the corporate world, but it applies in football and in a team sport, which is where we play, albeit not on the pitch. You've got to have a team, because if you're just we often in private equity or in investing, you could talk about key man risk or key woman risk or key person risk, and if that person, something were to happen to them or they were to leave the company, half the enterprise value walks with that, and so you can't really have that in that sense. And so those listening could sort of relate to that yes, it's important to invest in those who can be those stars, but you got to think about all the others that are contributing to it. And in fact, what I would go ahead and say is what you're saying is you may not have all stars. In fact, it's probably better off to have a lot of peak performers who are peaking at different points in time, because then the team keeps moving forward. And going back to the first episode of high performing teams, now there's a team peak performance happening, but as a result of different people. And it also allows to take weight away from individuals, but then other people can sort of say, hey, look, this is their turn, right? And they're sort of peaking, and this is their territory. So in business, it would be like a sales thing or an operational thing or a product thing or a marketing thing. Different functions would peak at different times, but the overall company benefits from that. So as CEO, thinking across the pool of people is probably the right way to do it, as what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. That one star performer, in addition to what you've said, are the risks. There's also the risk that as the leader of that person, you can subconsciously be caught in the trap of making the wrong decisions for the team as a whole in order to satisfy that one star performer. And, if you take that to its extreme, the star performer becomes useless if everybody else in the team leaves. And leaving doesn't necessarily mean resigning. It may mean just shutting down or becoming diminished versions of themselves. So there's all sorts of risk. Yes, I think so to come back to your initial question, how do you identify those people? I would say if you're the leader of a top team, your investment needs to be in every member of that team. When I go and do the work that I do with CEOs and their senior team, the CEO brings me in to work with everybody on that team. Because there is untapped performance in everybody, including if there is a current star of the team. So for everybody to be on that journey is super important, both for themselves and to see that everybody else is investing in themselves predominantly. Yes, the company is investing in them, but at the end of the day, they could refuse to be part of the process, right? But the power of seeing everybody recognizing the desire, the need to invest in oneself, with the company, with the CEO supporting that process and doing it him or herself also, that's where you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck, right? Because your nirvana is we've got a bunch of people who are on a journey at or close to peak performance, the combination of which is happening at the same time as us moving to high performance as a team, that team becomes pretty untouchable. Now, does it last
I think
forever? Probably not, because you've got to keep reinvesting. You've got to keep reinventing. People will come and go for all sorts of reasons. But it can be sustained over the long term, right? There are some businesses out there that give us that example. There are certainly some sports teams out there that give us that example. Yes, the cycle turns around, but that's because people, the risk is you become complacent about these things. That's, again, another human trait, right? That's just a human trait. But without that complacency, you can sustain individual peak performance and team high performance over a great period of time.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot of manifest in the investing world, whether it's private equity or VC. But when you've got a founder-led company and you've had a team, and then you start to bring in new talent and groom them, I think what also allows to happen is that company starts to get to the next level, and there's a reason that people are tapping out. And again, it's no one person. Obviously, in some individuals bring more useful things than others, depending on the scenario. But as a collective, the team 2.0 tends to do it better than team 1.0, and then 3.0 will probably do better than 2.0. And so I think that's unbelievable sort of insight that as people are listening in, so you can say, hey, look, I've got to really go back and reflect on myself as a peak performing individual. Where am I on that curve? What are my interferences? Start working on that. Number two is think about people around you as a collective, as to who are the ones that you want to invest in right away. How do you think about the broader team in light of that? And then ultimately, what are the environments that you as a leader can create for everyone to sort of start reducing their interferences and allowing that potential to shine a lot more, because only then you're going to get to that peak performance level.
Right.
David, this has been phenomenal again. I think we're starting to head towards the next episode, which is all about leadership and how leaders, one of the questions that I will have in that episode for us to discuss is, how do leaders cultivate and improve peak performers, and how do they balance the stuff that you just talked about, the balancing act, because that is one of many challenges of leaders that we'll be talking about. But before we end this episode, as we wrap up, what are some leaving thoughts, once again, a do and a don't for a CEO when you reflect on, peak performing individuals, whether it's for a CEO or a person, it could be for people listening for themselves. What's one counsel each that people can implement as they reflect on this discussion?
Yes, so I would say I think it's probably highly likely that people and leaders so far have predominantly, if not exclusively, focused on leveraging potential. And therefore, my experience tells me that there are only small marginal gains to be made here on in from that. I'm not suggesting forget it. I'm putting it into perspective and saying that actually the do is think about whether it's you as an individual or whether it's you, the leader of a group of individuals. How much time are you dedicating? How much thought time are you dedicating at the moment to working on interferences? Yeah. And if the answer is not a lot or not at all, that's your next step. Yeah. Because the gain that you will make in performance terms is substantial. It's where you're going to get the biggest leap you've probably ever made in your life so far. I'm very confident in making such a bold statement because I've seen it over the last 25 years.
Yeah.
you will make the biggest performance gain you've ever made in your life if you have this as your focus going forward. So without a doubt, that's my do recommendation to individuals and to leaders of others going forward. And my don't or my stop is don't believe anymore that you're the only person with these thoughts, with these feelings in the moments and the kind of examples that you and I have talked about today. You are absolutely not. And even though you may look out and only see swans around you, to continue our bird analogy, if I may stretch it this far, Rohit, those swans are paddling like hell below the water. Yeah. In other words, those people that you look at and think are great also have a duck that quacks, and probably quacks as often as yours does. But maybe they're just that little bit further in their journey of doing something about it.
Yep.
So my final do for this episode would be make the choice today to do something about your interferences.
David, really good. You know, it still sits in my head, lots of birds, but, you know, shut the duck up is where I'd sort of end the conversation with this episode. Thank you again for taking the time. We will see anyone who's listening and those who will in the next episode, which will be focused on peak performing leaders. But until then, thanks once again, David.
A huge difference between being a leader and demonstrating leadership. It is quite possible to be an inspirational leader that nobody wants to be like. It's not so much about what I do, it's much more about how I do it. But we're pretty appalling at checking in on the how. The most distinctive leaders and the most distinctive organizations, frankly, that I've worked with are those who have as one of their primary purposes the task of creating leaders who are better than themselves.
Subscribe to the People Quotient channel where leadership meets action. Powerful conversations with practical insights that you can use right now. See you in the next episode.